The first time Miku Aldera tasted a man's blood, she thought she was drinking her own death. It came out of him in slow pulses, dark as engine oil in the half-light of the carcass cave, and she had her mouth pressed to the split in his flight suit because her canteen had ruptured 8 hours ago, and her tongue had begun to feel like the inside of a wrung-out rag. He did not move. He had not moved since she dragged him out of the surf. His face was turned away from her, the side she could see purpled and salt-burned, one eye swollen shut, a thin crust of dried blood around his ear where his helmet seal had failed. She had stopped looking at his face because looking at his face made her stop, and she could not afford to stop. So she drank. The taste was iron and seawater and something faintly sweet, the way wet copper smells before a storm. She told herself it was a sacrament. She told herself the dead did not need it. She told herself a great many things in those minutes, kneeling in the wet dark with the Pacific hissing somewhere below them and the red bone of the vacant arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. And none of those things were true, and she knew it. But she drank anyway, because she was 26 years old and she did not want to die in this place. And then beneath her lips she felt his pulse. Not the sluggish, retreating thump of a body emptying itself. A pulse, steady, stubborn, human. She jerked back so hard she struck her head against the wet red rib above her, and tasted her own blood for the first time. And she said his name out loud. Said it the way she had said it the morning of the ceremony 20 years ago when she was 6 and he was 8, and they had stood on the gantry holding hands while the orbital elevator was lit for the first time, and the whole world below them sang. Kazu. He did not answer, but his heart kept beating, and that was enough for now to start her own again. 20 years before any of this, when the world still believed in monuments, they built one in the middle of the Pacific. The orbital elevator rose out of the sea on a platform the size of a city, a black filament so thin it could not be seen except where the sun caught it at certain angles, and then it appeared as a single line of light stitched between the ocean and the stars. It was meant to commemorate the peace. The Third War had ended 4 years earlier, and the dead had been counted, and the survivors had agreed, in the exhausted way that survivors agree to things, that humanity would never again squander itself fighting itself. The elevator was the promise made flesh, a road to the stars, a thing that could only be built together. Miku was 6. Her mother had pinned a paper flower to her dress, and her father had carried her on his shoulders through the crowd on the observation platform, and somewhere in the press of bodies, she had let go of her mother's hand to hold the hand of a boy she did not know yet, a boy with a bowl cut and a scab on his chin, because he had looked frightened and she had not wanted him to be frightened alone. His name was Kazuhiko Mori. He was 8. He was the son of the chief engineer who had designed the counterweight, and later that night his father would lift him onto the railing of the platform and let him touch the cable, the actual cable, and Kazu would describe it to her years afterward as not cold the way you expect metal to be cold, but warm, like something alive. The choir sang. The dignitaries spoke. A child from each of the surviving nations walked a length of white ribbon up the gantry and tied it to the base of the cable, and the last child to tie a ribbon was a girl from a country that had not existed 5 years earlier, and she cried while she did it, and the cameras loved her, and the world wept along. And then at 4 minutes past noon, the sky changed color. It was not red the way fire is red, or red the way blood is red. It was red the way pain is red if pain had a color, and it came out of the upper atmosphere in a single coiling line that resolved, as it descended, into the shape of a human being 4 kilometers tall, a human being made of red. It had no face that Miku could see, only the suggestion of one, the way a face is suggested in a cloud, and it descended along the line of the elevator as if the elevator had been built for it, as if the elevator were a road that had been laid down by us specifically for it to walk on, and when its bare red feet touched the platform stopped being a platform. She remembered her father's hand on her ankle. She remembered her mother screaming a single word that was not a word, just a sound, and then the sound stopping. She remembered Kazu's small fingers tightening around hers so hard that one of her own fingers would not bend properly for a month afterward. She remembered being lifted. She remembered the helicopter. She did not remember her parents again, in any form, ever, although for years she dreamed of her father's shoulders and the smell of his collar. The thing the world later named the vacant occupied the elevator that day and did not leave. More came. They poured down the cable from somewhere none of our instruments could see, and they spread across the Pacific in a slow red tide. And humanity, which had so recently sworn off war, remembered war very quickly. That was 2079. It was 2099 now, and Miku Aldera flew a black forward-swept-wing humanoid fighter called Tenra out of Yashima Base, which floated on the cold green back of the Pacific 80 kilometers from the foot of the elevator. And she had been at this war for 19 of the 20 years it had lasted. She had joined at 7. They took them young then. The 7th-generation pilots, the humanoid frames, required neural integration that had to begin before the cortex finished forming, and the program had taken every orphan it could find from the elevator district, and Miku had not been the youngest in her intake. She had been the calmest. They told her this later as if it were a compliment. She did not remember being calm. She remembered being too tired to scream. Kazu had been in the same intake. Of course he had. They had not let go of each other on the helicopter, and they had not let go of each other in the orphanage, and they had not let go of each other in the program. And by the time they were old enough to understand what had been done to them, they were already each other's only remaining piece of the world before. They were not lovers. They were not exactly siblings. They were something the language had not made a word for yet. Two people grown together at the root, the way two trees on a windward slope will sometimes fuse along the trunk, because there isn't enough soil for both to stand alone. He flew the white Tenra, FSX-01, Yum. She flew the black FSX-02, also Tenra, but the squadron called hers Karasu because it was black and because she was quiet. The other pilots in the Special Technology Research Wing called them the twins, even though they looked nothing alike, and the twins did not correct them. On the morning of the day she would drink his blood, she woke before her alarm, as she always did, and she lay in the narrow bunk with her hands folded on her sternum and listened to the bass around her. The hum of the desalinators, the slap of seawater against the pontoons. Somewhere 2 decks down, a mechanic singing a song in a language Miku did not know, a song her own mother had used to sing, although Miku no longer remembered her mother's voice well enough to be sure. She lay there until the song stopped, then she got up. Kazu was already in the mess. He had set a cup of tea at her place and a piece of the brown bread the base baked from algae flour and reconstituted yeast, and he was reading the operations brief on a flexible screen the color of a dirty window. He did not look up when she sat down. He never did. He always knew when she had arrived. He pushed the tea toward her with 2 fingers. "They want us at the foot today," he said. "Both of us." "Both." She tore the bread in half and gave him the larger piece, because he was bigger and because the bread tasted like nothing. "What's the package?" "Seismic charge, a real one, not a test." She chewed. "How big?" "Big enough to drop a tower." He turned the screen so she could see it. The brief was sparse. "A drop point along the southwest face of the elevator's basal platform, 200 meters down. A 2-frame insertion. Hers to deliver, his to escort. The window was 40 seconds. The vacant's response time at the base of the elevator was estimated at 51. Command says it'll buckle the platform. Command says a lot of things. They want it dropped before sunset. Why? They didn't say. She drank the tea. It was bitter and oversteeped and exactly the way she liked it, because he always made it the way she liked it, even when she had not told him she liked it. She did not thank him. She had not thanked him for tea in 15 years. It would have been an insult to thank him for tea. "All right," she said. He folded the screen. He looked at her then, only for a second, and she saw the thing she always saw in him, the thing she had seen on the gantry when he was 8 and she was 6, the thing that was not fear and was not hope, but was the closest a person could come to both at once. He had brown eyes with a fleck of green in the left one. He had a scar above his right eyebrow from a training accident when they were 12. He had a mouth that turned down at the corners even when he was happy, which was one of the ways you could tell he was happy. "Don't be slow today," he said. "I am never slow." "You are sometimes slow." "I am thorough." "You are sometimes slow." She finished the tea. She stood up. She put her hand on the back of his neck for the length of one breath, the way she had done since they were children, and he tilted his head into her palm for the length of that same breath. And then they walked out of the mess together to the hangar deck and did not touch each other again until everything was over. The hangar smelled the way it always smelled, which was the way a forge smells, plus brine, plus the faint chemical sweetness of the coolant. The seventh frames bled when they had been pushed too hard. Karasu hung in her cradle with her wings folded back along her spine and her head tucked, looking in the low orange dock lights, less like a machine than like a sleeping thing. 18 meters from heel to crown. Forward swept wings that locked into a delta when she went supersonic. Twin reactors at the shoulders. A cockpit set behind a sloped armor plate at the chest, so that when Miku climbed into her, she climbed, in effect, into the ribcage of a giant. She did not look at Karasu the way the other pilots looked at their frames. The others spoke to their machines. They named them. They patted them. Miku had never patted Karasu in her life. The relationship between them was the relationship between a hand and a glove, and a hand does not pat its glove. She climbed the gantry. She let the techs check her seals. She did not joke with them. She had never joked with them. They did not expect her to. Across the deck, Kazu was already half inside Yume. He was joking with his techs. He always joked with his techs. They loved him for it. The launch officer came up beside her on the gantry and put her hand on Miku's shoulder. Captain Ishii, 48, gray at the temples. A burn scar that ran from her jaw down inside her collar from the orbital elevator's first counterattack, the one nobody talked about. Ishii had flown a 6th-generation frame then. She had been the only pilot of her squadron to land. "Aldera," Ishii said. "Captain, the window is 40 seconds. I know. You don't make it back if you miss the window. I know." Ishii's hand tightened just a little. "He'll be on your 6. He'll stay on your 6. He has orders to stay on your 6. If you take a hit, he is to disengage and return. He has orders." Miku looked at her then. "He won't disengage. He has orders. He won't disengage." Ishii held her gaze a moment longer. Then she took her hand off Miku's shoulder. "Get in your frame, Lieutenant." Miku got in her frame. They launched into a sky the color of beaten tin. Karasu unfolded under her like a hand opening, the wings sweeping forward into their cruise position, the reactors at her shoulders flaring to a deep red that Miku felt in her own teeth through the neural link. The catapult flung her off the bow of Yashima, and the sea fell away beneath her, and for the first 3 seconds of every sortie, there was a feeling Miku had never been able to describe to anyone who was not also a pilot of a 7th-generation frame. A feeling like she had been compressed into a single point and then released, like she had been a held breath, and now she was the exhale. She heard, distantly, through the calm, Kazu's catapult fire. Yume came up off the deck behind her and slid into position on her right. Karasu Yume formation. Yume Karasu confirm. The sea unrolled beneath them, 80 kilometers to the foot of the elevator, at the cruise speed of a 7th, 4 minutes. The cable itself appeared first, as it always did, not as an object but as a vertical seam in the world, a place where the sky and the sea were stitched together by something too narrow to see. Then the platform appeared, the size of a city, listing now after 20 years of occupation, half of it underwater. Then the elevator's lower architecture, the great red coral growths the vacant had extruded along the cable, the bone-colored sheaths, the things that looked like organs and were not organs, the slow pulsing of the whole structure, which from this distance resembled, more than anything, an enormous sleeping animal that was also a tower. Miku had seen it 10,000 times. She had never gotten used to it. She did not believe any pilot ever had. Karasu, contact bearings. I see them. The vacants peeled off the upper structure in 2s and 3s, red humanoid forms unfolding from the cable's coral sheaths and dropping into the air on the long curved wings they grew from their shoulder blades when they wanted to fly. They came down the cable the way ants come down a tree. There were never not vacants on the cable. The question was always only how many. Today, the count climbed past 40 before Miku stopped counting. Karasu, 40 plus. I see them. Stay on my 6. On your 6. She went in. The thing about a 7th generation frame, the thing the briefings never said out loud, was that it was not really a machine. It was a body. It moved the way a body moved because the pilot inside it was, for the duration of the link, a body inside a body. And the outer body did what the inner body told it to do without the lag of levers or thought. Miku brought Karasu in low over the water, low enough that the wake of her passage threw up 2 parallel walls of white, and she rolled her up onto the cable from below. And the first vacant she met, she put a railgun slug through at a distance of 40 meters and watched it come apart in the slow tumbling way they came apart, as if their physics did not entirely overlap with ours. The second she took with her left fist, punched it through the chest, pulled her arm back red to the elbow. Kazu was on her 6. Kazu was always on her 6. He took the 2 that tried to come down on her from above. She heard his railgun on the comm, that double thump that meant he had fired and confirmed, the way he had been taught. 40 seconds, 40 seconds. She rose along the cable. This is where, if the world were a kinder world, the story would say she made the drop and got out clean. She made the drop, she did not get out clean. At the moment the seismic charge released from Karasu's underbelly and tumbled into the coral architecture of the platform. 4 vacants came out of the cable directly above her, the way wasps come out of a kicked nest, and one of them got a hand on Yum's left wing before Kazu could see it coming. Miku heard him say over the comm, very quietly, "Oh." That was all he said. Yum came apart in the air above her, not all at once, but in the long terrible way a 7th comes apart when the reactor seal goes, the wings folding the wrong way first, then the shoulders, then the white armor flaking off in sheets, and inside that disintegrating body was the body she had held the hand of on the gantry 20 years ago, and the body did not eject, because the ejection systems on a 7th did not work at that altitude. Because the briefings always said they did, but they never did, and she watched Yum fall. She watched him fall for 9 seconds. She knew it was 9 seconds, because the mission clock said so afterward. In those 9 seconds, the seismic charge she had just placed detonated, and the southwest face of the elevator's basal platform buckled, and a piece of red coral the size of an apartment building sheared off and fell into the Pacific, and command, 80 kilometers away, began to cheer. She did not hear them cheer. Her comm had cut out. She watched Yum hit the water. She watched the water take him. She watched the place where the water had taken him for another second, and then she banked Karasu hard over and went back to the base in a straight line at a speed that the manuals said the frame could not sustain, and the frame sustained it, because she made it. When she landed on Yashima, the techs had to cut her out of the cockpit. She had bitten through her lower lip. She did not remember biting through her lower lip. She did not remember the flight back. She remembered only one thing from those 4 minutes, which was that the sky was the color of beaten tin, and that there was a single gull, very high up, flying north, and that she had watched the gull instead of watching the place in the water where the wreckage was settling. Captain Ishii met her at the bottom of the gantry. She did not say anything. She put her arms around Miku, and Miku stood inside them and did not cry, because she did not know how anymore, and Ishii held her for a long time and then walked her down to the medics. That night the base threw a party for the buckling of the platform. Miku did not attend. For 4 days she did nothing. She slept. She ate when they brought food. She sat on her bunk and looked at the wall. The wall had a small water stain in the upper left corner shaped, if you squinted, like the island of Hokkaido. She had looked at this stain for 19 years and had never noticed it was shaped like Hokkaido. She noticed it now. On the morning of the 5th day, Captain Ishii came to her quarters. "Get up," Ishii said. "No." "Get up." "No." Ishii sat down on the bunk beside her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "There is something I have to tell you, and you are going to hate me for telling you it, but I have to tell you it because you would hate me more if I didn't." Miku did not look at her. Ishii said, "Recon flew the impact site yesterday. The seismic charge cracked the platform deeper than we hoped. There is a fissure running down the foundation almost to the bedrock. If we can get a second charge into that fissure, we can drop the elevator. Not damage it. Drop it. The whole thing. All the way to the sea floor." "That's good," Miku said. "It is. You should send someone." "Yes." Silence. "You want to send me?" Miku said. "Yes. By myself. It's a one-frame insertion. We can't spare the formation. And you are the only pilot we have left who has flown the cable at altitude inside the last week. You want to send me by myself to the foot of the elevator, where Kazu died?" "Yes." Miku looked at her then. She was not in that moment a person. She was the absence of a person. She was the place where a person had been. And Ishii, who had seen this before, who had been this before, did not look away. "All right," Miku said. She launched at 0400 the next morning into a sky still black at the horizon and bleeding pink only at the top. The way the sky bleeds in those few minutes before dawn, when the dawn is sure of itself, but has not yet committed. Karasu felt wrong without Yume on her right. The empty place in her formation was a missing tooth she could not stop touching with her tongue. The sea unrolled beneath her. The cable appeared. The platform appeared. The red architecture appeared. She did not look at the place in the water where Yume had gone down. She had told herself she would not look. She did not look. The mission was meant to take 6 minutes. It took 2. The vacants knew. They had not known last time. They knew now. They came off the cable in numbers Miku had never seen, 50, 60, 100, the air above the platform thick with them like flies above a wound, and she put Karasu into a dive at a speed that pulled the corners of her mouth back from her teeth, and she released the second charge at the edge of her launch envelope, and she pulled up. She did not pull up far enough. A vacant came up out of the cable directly in front of her, and she had time to see, very clearly, the suggestion of a face on the front of it. The not-quite face she had seen for the first time when she was 6 on the gantry, and then it had her right wing. Karasu came apart the way Yume had come apart. The last thing Miku heard before her cockpit ejected, the cockpit did eject, against every briefing, against every prediction, because Ishii had ordered the ejection charges replaced the night before and had not told her, was the sound of the second charge detonating inside the platform's foundation, and the sound that came after it, which was a long, low groan of something enormous beginning to take its weight off the ground. She woke underwater. For a long time she did not know she had woken. She thought she was still inside the dream she had been having, the dream about her father's shoulders and the smell of his collar, and then she felt cold, and then she felt the cold as wet, and then she opened her eyes. The cockpit had filled to her chest, salt water black. Above her through the cracked canopy she could see a red ceiling, ribbed, vast, the inside of something. She had landed inside a piece of the vacant coral, one of the sheaths that had sheared off the platform when the seismic charge cracked it open, now floating somewhere on the Pacific. She did not know how far from Yashima. She did not know how far from anywhere. She got out of the cockpit. The seals had popped on impact, the canopy half shattered. She climbed up through the wreckage with the strength of a person who has not yet decided whether to keep being alive. She emerged onto the inside of the red coral cathedral, which curved over her in slow arches, dripping seawater, faintly luminescent at the highest points where the sun came through pinholes in the structure above. The floor was wet and ridged and not exactly floor, more like the inside surface of a lung. She walked. She did not know where she walked toward. The cathedral was perhaps 300 meters across at its widest. There were corridors leading off it, narrower passages of red bone curving away into darkness. She picked the one that smelled least like the smell of the cathedral, which was a smell like wet metal and old meat. Her canteen had ruptured on impact. She found this out when she went a drink from it. Her flight suit was torn at the left thigh and bleeding sluggishly. She pressed her hand to it and kept walking. She walked for hours. She did not know how many. The light from the pinholes above shifted from white to gold to a deepening rose. At some point, she sat down to rest and woke up 2 hours later with her cheek pressed against the wet red floor of the cathedral, and the salt of it crusted on her lip. She got up. She walked. She came at last into a smaller chamber, a side gallery off the main cathedral where the floor sloped down to a kind of shore, and beyond the shore was the Pacific, dark and very calm, lapping against the inside of the coral. And on the shore, half in the water and half out of it, was the body of a man. His flight suit was white, what was left of it. She knelt beside him before her mind had finished telling her what her eyes were already telling her, before she had let herself say the word that was rising in her like a held sneeze, because she had spent 4 days in a bunk telling herself that the dead were dead, and that she would not be one of those women who told themselves the dead were not dead, because she had seen that kind of grief in the orphanage, and it had killed 2 of her friends before they were 10 years old, and she had sworn she would never. She had sworn. She knelt beside him. She pulled him out of the water by his armpits and turned him onto his back. His face was turned away from her. The side she could see was purpled and salt-burned, one eye swollen shut. She did not say his name. She would not say his name. She unsealed the chest plate of his flight suit, the way she had been trained, to look for the wound that had killed him, because there was always the wound that had killed them, and you had to look at it, because if you did not look at it, you did not believe it, and if you did not believe it, you became one of those women in the orphanage. She found the wound. It was on the inside of his left thigh where the suit had split along the seal. It was still bleeding, a slow ooze dark in the half-light. She put her finger in it, almost without meaning to. The blood was warm. She told herself the blood of the dead stays warm for a long time inside a flight suit. She told herself this firmly. She did not believe herself. Her tongue was a wrung-out rag in her mouth. Her canteen had ruptured 8 hours ago. The Pacific around them was salt and would kill her faster than dehydration would. The vacant coral did not weep fresh water. She had been licking the walls for an hour with no result. She had a wound in her own thigh that had not stopped bleeding. She was 26 years old, and she was alone inside a piece of red bone the size of a small island, drifting on an ocean that began nowhere she knew. She put her mouth to the wound and she drank. And then his pulse moved under her lip, and the world reassembled itself in the order it had taken 20 years to fall apart in. She fell back, she struck her head, she tasted her own blood, she said his name. Kazu. He did not answer. She pressed both hands to his chest. His ribs rose, they rose. They had been rising the whole time. She had not let herself see them rise. She had been so certain. She had been so prepared to be certain. Kazu. His eyelid, the one that was not swollen shut, fluttered. Kazu, you bastard. Kazu, you absolute Kazu. He opened the eye, he looked at her. He did not at first seem to know who she was. Then he did. The corners of his mouth turned down in the way they did when he was happy. Miku, he said, it was not a voice. It was the husk where a voice had been. What are you doing here? I crashed. He thought about this for what seemed like a long time. Then he said, me too. She put her forehead down on his chest and she made a sound she had never made before in her life, a sound that was not crying and was not laughing but had the shape of both, and she stayed like that until the sound stopped. He raised one hand. He set it on the back of her head. He did not stroke her hair. He had never stroked her hair. He just held the back of her head, the way she had held the back of his neck 4 mornings ago in the mess, and they stayed like that. And outside, on the Pacific, the sun began to set. He had been alive for 4 days. She got the story out of him in pieces over the next 2 days, because there were not many hours in those days when both of them could be awake at the same time, and the hours they spent mostly on the work of staying alive, which turned out to be considerable. He had ejected from Hume. He should not have been able to. The ejection systems on a 7th did not work at the altitude he had been at. But Ishii, the same Ishii who had replaced the charges in Karasu's cockpit, had also, 2 months earlier, replaced the charges in Hume, because Ishii had a habit, she said later, of not believing the briefings about which systems worked at which altitudes. The cockpit had punched out at the last possible moment, and had come down in the Pacific in roughly the same place the wreckage of Hume had come down, and Kazu had been picked up by the rising tide of red coral the seismic charge had shaken loose, and he had floated in and out of consciousness inside the same red cathedral she was in now, for 4 days, drinking the seawater that pooled in the lower passages, because the seawater that pooled in the lower passages, it turned out, was not seawater, or not entirely. The coral filtered it. He did not understand the mechanism. He was a pilot, not a biologist. But the water in the low passages was drinkable mostly, if you did not drink too much of it at once, and he had been drinking too much of it at once and it was probably killing him. And now she was here and she would drink it too, and they would die together, but more slowly. You aren't going to die, she said. I am. You are not. Miku. I will carry you out. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said in his husk of a voice, you always think you can carry me out. I always can. You can't this time. Watch me, she said. The thing about humanity, the thing the Vacants had never understood and would never understand, was not its courage. The Vacants understood courage. Courage was an animal trait. They had seen courage in pilots and in foot soldiers, and in the captains of dying ships, and they had catalogued it the way they catalogued everything, in the slow, patient way of a species that had been at this for longer than ours had had language. Courage did not surprise them. What surprised them, what would always surprise them, was the human refusal to accept the categories of the dead and the living as the categories existed. A vacant, presented with a body that was not moving, would file the body under not moving and proceed. A human, presented with the same body, would put her mouth on its wound and drink, and feel the pulse under her lip, and discover that the not moving body was a not yet moving body, and would carry it the rest of the way back into the moving. It was not courage. It was not even hope. It was a kind of stubbornness so deep that the species had not, in 20,000 years, found a name for it. Miku Aldera, on the second night inside the Red Cathedral, with Kazu's head in her lap and her own thigh wound dressed with a strip of his flight suit, and her tongue still tasting faintly of his blood, began to plan. The plan came out of the wreckage of Karasu. The frame was 300 meters away, jammed up against the cathedral wall, half submerged. The cockpit was gutted. The right arm was sheared off at the shoulder, but the reactor at the left shoulder, when she crawled back to it through the dark on the morning of the third day, was intact. The status light was steady amber. The containment seal had not breached. The reactor was a small fusion design, the kind a seventh carried at each shoulder for redundancy, and Miku had spent 8 years of her training learning every wire in it. She knew how to make it not be intact. She crawled back to Kazu, she told him. He did not say anything for a while. He was sitting up now against the curved red wall of the smaller chamber, his color slightly better, his bad eye still swollen shut but the good one bright. She had been hand-feeding him the strange filtered water in tablespoons from the cap of her canteen. He had been keeping it down. "How big?" he said. "Big enough." "How big?" "Big enough to drop the rest of the platform, if we can get it close." He nodded slowly. "We are floating," he said. "We are." "Toward the platform?" "Yes." "Or away from it?" "I have been watching the sun. We're going toward it. The current here runs north along the cable. We will pass within a kilometer of the basal platform inside, I think, 2 days." "And the timer?" "The timer I can rig from the cockpit electronics. It will give us 20 minutes. 20 minutes from a kilometer out." "Yes." "We can't outrun a fusion detonation in 20 minutes from 1 kilometer out." "No." He did not say anything to this. He looked at her with his one good eye and his mouth turned down at the corners. Then he said, "There's a life raft in your ejection kit." "There is." "Is the raft fast enough?" "With a tailwind, maybe." "With a tailwind." "With a tailwind." He laughed. It was the husk of a laugh. He laughed for a long time, and she found herself laughing too, the two of them sitting on the floor of a red coral cathedral on the back of the Pacific Ocean, laughing because there was nothing else to do, and the laugh, when it was over, left them both quiet in a way that was not the quiet of despair. "All right," he said. "All right." It took them a day and a half to rig the reactor. But before that there was the slow work of keeping him alive long enough to help her rig it, and the slower work of keeping herself alive long enough to do the rigging, and neither of these things was as straightforward as the briefings would have suggested. The water in the low passages of the cathedral, the water Kazu had been drinking, came up out of the coral in small clear seeps at the bottom of certain ridges, and it tasted of metal and faintly of the inside of a flower, and it made the lining of her mouth tingle for an hour after she drank it. She did not drink much of it at first. She drank only a thimbleful, the cap of her ruptured canteen, and she waited an hour and watched her own hands for tremor and her own eyes in the small dented mirror of her cockpit panel for the dilation of pupils, and when neither happened, she drank another thimbleful. She did this for 6 hours before she let him have any. She had told him she would not let him die. She had not said anything to him about not letting herself die first, but he understood. He always understood. The food problem she solved more crudely. There were small white things, not quite barnacles and not quite shellfish, that clung to the underside of the coral in clusters where the water came in, and on the second morning she pried one off with the broken edge of a cockpit panel and looked at it for a long time. It looked back at her, or seemed to. She ate it raw. She did not die. She ate 4 more. She fed Kazu too, after he had been awake for an hour and held down water. They sat together on the wet red floor of the smaller chamber and chewed the strange flesh of the not shellfish. And Kazu, who had been a vegetarian for 3 years in his 20s, said, "We will not tell anyone about this part." "No," she said. "We will say we lived on the water." "On the water. And on the will of God." "You don't believe in God." "I do this morning." She looked at him. He was chewing slowly. His swollen eye was beginning to drain. He looked terrible. He looked alive. She had never in her life looked at him and not wanted to put her hand on the back of his neck, and she did so now, and he tilted his head into her palm, and they sat like that on the floor of the red bone of their enemy and chewed the small wet flesh of small white things, and outside the Pacific lifted and lowered them, and the sun moved across the pinhole sky above their heads, and they were, for an hour, simply two people sharing a meal. Then they went back to work. She did most of the work. He passed her tools. The tools were what she had stripped from Karasu's cockpit panel, which was not many tools, but it was enough, because she had been taught by men and women who had assumed she would one day have to do something like this with not enough tools. On the morning of the day they would do it, she crawled back into the smaller chamber to find him humming. He had not been humming when she left. He was sitting up against the wall and humming a song under his breath, very quietly, almost without sound, and she stopped in the entrance to the chamber and listened, because she knew the song. She knew the song. It was the song the mechanic 2 decks down had been singing the morning of the day she would drink his blood. It was the song her mother had sung. It was a song in a language she did not speak. It was the song everyone's mother had sung, in some version, in some language, because there were songs like that, songs that came down through the species the way certain bones came down through the species, songs older than the languages they were sung in. Kazu had heard her mother sing it, once on the gantry, 20 years ago, when she was 6 and he was 8 and they had stood holding hands. He had remembered it. He was humming it now to keep himself awake. She knelt down beside him. She put her hand on the back of his neck. He tilted his head into her palm. "You ready?" she said. "I am ready." "You sure?" "I am sure. I'm going to set it for 30 minutes instead of 20. Miku. 30. The current isn't that fast. 30. He looked at her. The good eye was steady. The bad eye was beginning to open. "All right," he said, 30. The current did what currents do. She set the timer at the 30th minute past the 11th hour of their 4th day inside the Red Cathedral, and she carried Kazu on her back, 300 meters across the wet red floor to the edge of the smaller chamber, where the Pacific lapped against the inside of the coral, and she inflated the life raft from her ejection kit, and laid him in it and got in beside him, and they pushed off from the inside of the bone the vacant had grown around them, and they paddled. With the small collapsible paddles from the ejection kit, out through the mouth of the cathedral into the open sea. The basal platform of the orbital elevator was 1,100 meters away. The current was running them past it on the eastern side at 4 knots. Behind them, inside the cathedral, the reactor she had built into a bomb was counting down from 30. The sky was the color of beaten tin. There was a single gull, very high up, flying north. She watched the gull. She did not watch the place behind them where the cathedral was. She watched the gull because she had watched a gull on the day she lost him, and she was going to watch a gull on the day she did not lose him, and the universe could go to hell about it if the universe had an opinion. Kazu lay against her in the raft. His good eye was open. His bad eye was open too now, a slit of brown with a fleck of green in it. He was watching her face. He had been watching her face for most of the last day. "Miku." "Yes. If we don't make it." "We're going to make it." "If we don't." "Kazu." "Listen." She listened. He said, "Thank you for the tea." She did not laugh, she did not cry. She held his hand, she said, "Thank you for the bread." He smiled. It was the down-turned smile, the one that meant he was happy. It tasted like nothing. It always tasted like nothing. "You always gave me the bigger piece." "You were bigger." "You were always bigger, Miku." She did not know what he meant by that. She did not ask. She held his hand and watched the gull and the current carried them, and behind them, inside the red bone of the vacant coral, a reactor counted down from 20, then 10, then 5. At 0, the cathedral became light. Then it became sound. The sound came across the water as a wall and hit the raft and lifted the raft, and the raft went sideways across the surface of the sea for a distance Miku did not afterward remember measuring. And they did not capsize, because she had inflated the outriggers, because she had been taught by men and women who assumed she would one day have to inflate the outriggers. And when the raft came down again, the basal platform of the orbital elevator was missing the southwest quarter of itself. The elevator stood for another 6 seconds. Then it began to lean. She had imagined, all her life, what it would look like when the elevator fell. She had imagined it as a child in the orphanage, lying on her bunk after lights out, and she had imagined it as a cadet, with her instructors making her draw the angles of structural collapse on a chalkboard, and she had imagined it as a pilot, in the long minutes between sorties, and none of the things she had imagined was the thing she saw. It did not fall. It lay down. The cable, 4 kilometers of black filament from the sea to the sky, did not break. It bent. It bent at the basal platform and at 3 points along its lower length, and the whole thing lay down across the eastern Pacific the way a person who is too tired to stand lies down across a bed, in slow, exhausted increments, and the red architecture along it came off in sheets, and the vacants on the cable came off in sheets, and they fell, all of them, the cable and the coral and the bodies, and they fell for a long time, because 4 kilometers is a long way to fall. And they hit the sea with a sound that Miku heard inside her teeth. Then the sea was quiet. There was a single gull, very high up, flying north. She watched the gull. She held Kazu's hand. She did not look at the place where the elevator had been. The pickup came 8 hours later. It came in the form of a Yashima rescue VTOL, vectored to the position of her flight suit transponder, which had begun broadcasting the moment the elevator went down, because the elevator going down had been the prearranged signal for transponders to begin broadcasting, because Ishii, who did not believe the briefings, had set it up that way without telling anybody. The pilot of the VTOL was Ishii. Of course it was Ishii. She came down on the raft in the kind of hover that ought not to have been possible in the chop the elevator's collapse had thrown into the Pacific, and her loadmaster put down a line, and Miku looped the line under Kazu's arms first, because she had said she would carry him out, and she had carried him out, and now she would be the one to send him up first, because that was the order of things. He went up. She watched him go. The line came down again. She went up. Inside the VTOL it was warm and loud and smelled of jet fuel and someone's leftover coffee, and Ishii looked over her shoulder from the cockpit, and her burn scar was the color of old iron in the dashboard light, and she said, "You took your time, Aldera." "I am thorough," Miku said. Ishii laughed. She laughed a long time. She had not laughed, anybody who knew her would have said, in 8 years. The loadmaster wrapped Miku in a thermal blanket and put a canteen in her hand, a real canteen full of real water, and Miku drank it in slow sips, the way Kazu had taught her 2 days ago in a red coral cathedral on the back of the Pacific Ocean. Across from her on the deck of the VTOL, Kazu lay under his own thermal blanket. His bad eye was open. His good eye was open. He was watching her face. He was always watching her face. She thought, perhaps, he had been watching her face since the gantry when they were 6 and 8. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Outside the VTOL window, behind them, the sky to the east was lower than it had been when they were children. It was lower because the thing that had been holding it up was no longer holding it up. The orbital elevator was gone. The piece it had been built to commemorate was not back, and the dead it had been built in honor of were not back, and the parents on the gantry were not back, and the small bowl-cut boy with the scab on his chin and the small girl with the paper flower on her dress were not exactly back either, because 20 years of war does what it does. But the cable was down. And the cathedral that had grown out of it was down. And the species that had built the cable and the species that had grown the cathedral, would now have to do whatever they were going to do next on a planet whose sky was a little emptier than it had been the day before. Miku Aldera, 26 years old, the first time in 19 years that she had been in a moving vehicle she was not piloting, watched the sky and felt her own heart beat steady and stubborn inside her chest, and she thought very clearly in words, "We are difficult. We are a difficult species. We do not let go." There would be more vacants. She knew this. Everyone in the VTOL knew this. The vacants had come from somewhere, and the elevator had only been a road, and the road was down. But the place the road led to was still up there, and the things that had walked down the road would find another way down, eventually. Because the things that had walked down the road were patient in the way, a species is patient when it has been at war for longer than the other species has had language. But, in the cargo bay of the VTOL, while HFY flew them back to a base that no longer floated under the shadow of an orbital cable, Kazumari, who had been dead for 4 days, who had floated on the back of the Pacific Ocean inside a piece of red bone, who had drunk water filtered through the body of his enemy and survived it, who had been kept alive on the 3rd night by a woman who put her mouth to his wound because she did not have any water of her own, reached his hand across the gap between the 2 stretchers and took Miku Aldera's hand in his. She let him. She had been letting him take her hand since she was 6. She would let him take it for a long time after this. Outside, the gull was still flying north. It was a small gull. It had a small life. It did not know about the cable, or the vacants, or the small woman in the cargo bay of the VTOL who had drunk a man's blood in the middle of the war and discovered under her lip that he was still alive. It only knew that it was flying north, and that the sky was a little emptier than it had been yesterday, and that this was good for a gull. She watched it until it disappeared. She held his hand. The VTOL flew on. 2 months later, on a clear morning in late autumn, with the sea flat and the sky the color of an unwashed window, Miku Aldera stood on the deck of Yashima Base in a uniform that no longer had a special technology research patch on the sleeve, because the special technology research wing had been dissolved with the elevator, and she watched the construction crews lower the first pylon of the new memorial into the sea. The memorial was HFY's idea. It was not a tower. It was a single black ring, 3 meters wide, anchored to the sea floor at the point where the basal platform of the orbital elevator had been. From above, from a passing aircraft, it would look like a hole in the water. From below, from a diving submersible, it would look like a window into the sky. It was not a monument to anything. It was a place to stand still and notice the absence. Kazu stood next to her on the deck. His bad eye had healed badly. He could see out of it now, but only at a slight angle, so that when he looked at her, he had to turn his head a little to the left, which gave him, permanently, a look of being slightly puzzled by her. Miku liked it. She had always wanted him to be slightly puzzled by her. He had always been entirely too sure. "You think they'll come back?" he said. "Yes. Soon. Maybe." He nodded. He took her hand. He had begun, since the cathedral, to take her hand without waiting for her to take his, which was a new development in the long, quiet history of their hands, and Miku had not yet decided what to do about it. She did not move her hand. "We're going to be ready," he said. "We are. Are we?" "Yes." He looked at her with his slightly puzzled angle. He said, "How do you know?" She thought about it. She thought about the gantry, and the helicopter, and the orphanage, and the program, and the years and years and years of flying a black forward-swept-wing humanoid frame over a cold green sea toward a red cathedral that her parents had been killed under. And she thought about a tongue like a wrung-out rag and a pulse under her lip. And she thought about how the species she belonged to had taken a road built for peace and lost it to a thing 4 kilometers tall, and then spent 20 years getting it back. Kilometer by kilometer, until they took it down themselves rather than leave it standing in the wrong hands. She thought about how, somewhere up there, the things that had walked down the cable were perhaps now beginning to understand the species they had picked a fight with. She thought about how, in the long catalogs the vacants kept of the courage of the species, there was perhaps now a new entry, written in whatever the vacants wrote with, that did not say courage. It said instead something that translated into our language only awkwardly, something that meant approximately, they do not stop. They do not stop when you kill them. They do not stop when you kill the ones they love. They do not stop when you kill the road they built to the stars. They will drink your blood if it keeps them moving. They will drink each other's blood. They will drink their own. They do not stop. Miku Aldera, 26 years old, holding the hand of a man she had thought dead and then drunk from, and then carried out of the inside of a red cathedral on the back of the Pacific Ocean, looked at her oldest friend with his slightly puzzled angle, and she smiled a small smile, and she said, "Because we are difficult, Kazu. We are a very, very difficult species, and we have had practice." He smiled back, the downturned smile, the one that meant he was happy. Above them, very high up, a gull was flying north. The sea moved. The pylon went down. The world went on, with its sky a little emptier than before, and with the people in it a little harder to kill than they had been the day before that, and somewhere far up the curve of the planet, a thing that was not a gull and not a cable but something else, something patient, considered the species below and adjusted, very slightly, its plans. It would come again. It would come, and they would be ready because they were difficult, and because they had had practice, and because, on a wet red floor in the middle of a war, a small dark-haired woman had put her mouth to a wound and tasted, under the iron and the seawater, the one thing in the universe the vacants had never learned to file. A pulse. Steady. Stubborn. Human.